What if the deadliest shot in the West was the last person anyone would suspect? Imagine this, a sun-baked ranch nestled in the rolling hills of Montana Territory, where the scent of prairie grass mingles with the earthy aroma of cattle. In the midst of it all stands Emma Thorne, a rancher's wife known for her gentle demeanor and warm smile. To everyone in the small town of Cedar Ridge, she's just another hardworking woman, tending to her garden and supporting her husband James as he builds their cattle empire. But here's the kicker. She's far more than she appears. And today, the bandits who dare to cross her path are about to learn the deadliest lesson of their lives. Before diving in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this story will change everything you thought you knew about the Wild West. The scene opens slowly, the camera panning across the vast Montana landscape. Rolling hills stretch as far as the eye can see, dotted with grazing cattle under the brilliant blue sky. At the heart of this picturesque scene stands the Thorne Ranch, a testament to years of hard work and determination. Emma moves with practiced ease through her daily routine, her calloused hands testament to years of ranch work. She tends to her thriving vegetable garden, exchanges pleasantries with the ranch hands, and keeps the household running with quiet efficiency. At first glance, Emma seems like any other rancher's wife in the territory. Her long, dark hair is always neatly braided, her simple dress practical for the demands of ranch life. She's known throughout Cedar Ridge for her apple pies at the county fair and her gentle way with horses. The local children adore her storytelling at the Sunday school, and the women in town often seek her advice on everything from canning vegetables to treating fever. But beneath this peaceful exterior lies a secret that even her husband James doesn't fully comprehend. Emma Thorne wasn't always Emma Thorne, and the life she's built here in Cedar Ridge is far removed from the one she left behind. Years ago, she was known by another name, one that still sends shivers down the spines of those who remember the legends of the frontier. The morning starts like any other, with Emma preparing breakfast for James and the ranch hands. The aroma of coffee and fresh biscuits fills the kitchen as she moves with practiced grace between the wood-burning stove and the heavy oak table. Through the window, she can see the men already at work, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun as they prepare for another day of moving cattle. James comes in for his morning coffee, pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Beautiful morning," he says, his voice warm with affection. "Thinking about riding into town later to pick up some supplies. Would you like to come along?" Emma smiles, wiping her hands on her apron. "I should stay here today. Those preserves won't make themselves, and I promised Mrs. Henderson I'd have some ready for the church social next week." As James heads back out, Emma watches him go, a shadow of something deeper flickering across her face. She absently touches the locket at her throat, the one piece of jewelry she never removes. Inside isn't a photo or a lock of hair, as most would expect, but something else entirely, something that connects her to the life she left behind. The day unfolds with its usual rhythm, but there's a tension in the air that Emma can't quite shake. Her instincts, honed through years she never speaks about, tell her something isn't right. She notices small details that others might miss: the nervous behavior of the cattle in the south pasture, the unusual dust clouds on the horizon, the way the birds have gone quiet in the cottonwood trees. As she hangs laundry on the line, her movements deliberate and precise, Emma's eyes constantly scan the surrounding landscape. To anyone watching, she appears to be simply going about her chores, but her mind is alert, processing every movement, every sound. The weight of the derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt is a constant reminder of who she really is, who she's always been. Little do the people of Cedar Ridge know that the woman they see as a simple rancher's wife once rode with the most notorious peacekeepers in the territories. They don't know that the hands that now knead bread dough and tend to garden plants once handled Colt revolvers with deadly precision. They don't know that beneath her quiet exterior lies the instincts and skills of someone who brought law to lawless lands. The bustling ranch life continues around her, ranch hands moving cattle, the blacksmith working at his forge, the cook preparing the midday meal. But Emma's attention is drawn to the growing cloud of dust on the horizon. To most, it might look like a cattle drive or travelers passing through, but she knows better. The pattern of movement, the speed of approach, it speaks of something else entirely. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, Emma's suspicions grow stronger. She's seen this before, knows the signs all too well. The calm before the storm, the quiet that precedes chaos. Her hands may have spent the last few years working ranch land and tending house, but they haven't forgotten their true purpose. Like a well-oiled gun kept hidden away, her skills remain sharp, waiting for the moment they're needed once again. The scene shifts to Cedar Ridge, a frontier town where Emma runs her weekly errands. The wooden boardwalks creak under her boots as she makes her way from the general store to the post office, her basket filled with supplies for the ranch. The townsfolk greet her warmly. To them, she's James Thorne's devoted wife, the woman who makes the best peach cobbler this side of the Mississippi and never misses a Sunday service. Sheriff Miller tips his hat as she passes, and Emma returns his greeting with a gentle smile. The irony isn't lost on her. There was a time when she wore a badge of her own, though none here would ever suspect it. The sheriff, like everyone else, sees only what she allows them to see, a settled woman in her early 30s, content with her quiet life on the ranch. Inside the general store, Emma carefully selects her purchases while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations around her. Old habits die hard, and information has always been as valuable as ammunition in her experience. Mr. Peterson, the store owner, chatters away as he weighs her sugar and coffee. "Heard tell of some trouble up north," he says, measuring coffee beans into a paper bag. "Stagecoach got hit yesterday just past Black Rock Creek. They say it was the Carson gang, getting mighty bold these days." Emma's fingers pause briefly on a bolt of calico fabric, her mind automatically calculating distances and likely trajectories. The Carson gang had a reputation for violence, and Black Rock Creek was less than 30 miles from Cedar Ridge. Close enough to be concerning, but she keeps her voice casual as she responds, "That's troubling news, Mr. Peterson. I'm sure the sheriff will handle it." As she loads her purchases into the wagon, Emma notices 3 strangers lounging outside the saloon. Their horses are too fine for simple travelers, their guns too well maintained for random drifters. She recognizes the look in their eyes, the predatory gaze of men sizing up potential targets. Her hand brushes unconsciously against her skirt, feeling the reassuring presence of her hidden derringer. The way they watch the town bank across the street tells her everything she needs to know. Cedar Ridge isn't a wealthy town, but it's the last stop before the railroad junction, and the bank often holds substantial deposits from local ranches and mining operations. It would make an appealing target for men of their inclination. Back at the ranch, Emma goes about her afternoon routine with heightened awareness. She positions herself near windows as she works, keeping the approaching roads in view. The ranch hands notice nothing unusual as she brings them fresh water and cornbread, but her movements are measured, precise, like a chess player positioning pieces on a board. In the kitchen, she opens a locked trunk that everyone assumes holds her wedding dress and family mementos. Beneath the carefully folded fabric lies something else entirely, a gun belt containing 2 pristine Colt Peacemakers, kept clean and oiled despite years of disuse. Her fingers trace the worn leather, memories flooding back of days spent bringing justice to lawless territories. She'd been known as Shadow back then, a name whispered with both fear and respect across the frontier. Few knew her true identity, and fewer still knew she was a woman. The handful who did discover her secret didn't live long enough to share it. Her reputation grew from her ability to appear seemingly out of nowhere, dispense justice with deadly accuracy, and vanish just as quickly. That life ended the day she met James Thorne. He was different from anyone she'd ever known, honest, hardworking, and kind in a way that made her want to be better. When he proposed, she saw a chance at a different kind of life, one where she could build something instead of just tearing down the wicked. She hung up her guns and badge, moved to Cedar Ridge, and became Emma Thorne. As she prepares dinner, Emma reflects on the changes in her life. The smell of baking bread fills the kitchen, so different from the gun smoke and trail dust of her past. She's found genuine joy in this simple life, in James's love, in the satisfaction of working the land, in being part of a community. But she's never let herself become soft, never fully let go of the skills that kept her alive through countless dangerous situations. Every morning, before anyone else wakes, she practices. In the pre-dawn darkness, her hands move through the motions of drawing and aiming, muscle memory kept sharp through endless repetition. She can still hit a tin can at 50 paces, though no one on the ranch has ever seen her handle anything more dangerous than a kitchen knife. The sun begins to set, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. James and the ranch hands come in from the fields, tired but satisfied with the day's work. Emma serves dinner, listening to their conversation about cattle prices and grazing patterns, all while part of her mind remains alert to the world beyond the ranch house walls. As night falls, she notices James is troubled. He keeps glancing out the windows, his shoulders tense. "Everything all right?" she asks, though she already suspects the answer. "Probably nothing," he says, but his voice is uncertain. "Just some of the hands spotted unfamiliar tracks near the north pasture. Might be rustlers scouting the herd." Emma nods sympathetically, her expression giving nothing away. But internally, her mind is already working, calculating possibilities, forming plans. If trouble is coming, and her instincts tell her it is, she'll be ready. The peaceful life she's built here is worth protecting, even if it means revealing who she really is. The next morning dawns with an unsettling stillness. Even the ever-present Montana wind seems to have died down, leaving the ranch wrapped in an eerie quiet that sets Emma's nerves on edge. She moves through her morning routine with heightened awareness, every sense attuned to the smallest changes in her surroundings. As she gathers eggs from the chicken coop, her trained eyes catch subtle signs that others might miss. The nervous behavior of the horses in the corral, the way the cattle bunch together instead of spreading out to graze. James notices her distraction over breakfast. "Something bothering you, darling?" he asks, his weathered face creased with concern. Emma forces a smile, pouring him another cup of coffee with steady hands that belie her inner tension. "Just thinking about all the work that needs doing today," she replies smoothly. Years of undercover work have made her an excellent liar, though it pains her to deceive the man she loves. Those preserves won't put themselves up. As James heads out to work with the cattle, Emma watches him go with a mixture of love and apprehension. The man knows every aspect of ranching, can read weather patterns like a book, and has built this spread from nothing through sheer determination. But he knows nothing of the darker sides of human nature, the kind of evil she's spent years fighting. His innocence is part of what drew her to him, but now it might put him in danger. Moving to the kitchen window, Emma begins her daily tasks while maintaining a clear view of the surrounding landscape. Her hands work automatically at kneading bread dough as her mind calculates distances and defensive positions. The ranch house sits on a slight rise, giving her a good vantage point of the main approach roads. The barn and bunkhouse form natural barriers that could be used for cover if needed. Through the window, she spots 3 ranch hands riding out to check the north pasture. Something about their formation triggers a memory. A technique she'd seen used by raiders in the Dakota Territory, scouts spreading out to assess a target's defenses. But these are men she knows, men who've worked the ranch for years. She's served them countless meals, mended their clothes, treated their injuries. Yet doubt gnaws at her. In her previous life, she'd learned the hard way that betrayal often comes from those closest to you. Her fingers work the dough with more force than necessary as she remembers the partner who'd turned on her during a dangerous mission in New Mexico. She'd trusted him with her life, right until the moment he tried to take it. Mid-morning brings the arrival of Pete Anderson, one of the newer ranch hands, riding hard from town. He dismounts in a cloud of dust, his face flushed with exertion. "Mrs. Thorne," he calls out, hurrying to the porch where Emma stands wiping her hands on her apron. "Just came from Cedar Ridge." The bank was robbed this morning, right after opening. Sheriffs gathering a posse. Emma's expression remains neutral, but her mind races. The strangers she'd spotted outside the saloon yesterday. This had been their real purpose. Casing the bank had likely been a diversion, getting the town to focus its attention there while they planned something bigger. "Was anyone hurt?" she asks, her voice steady. When Pete shakes his head, she continues. "Better get back to work then." Mr. Thorne will want to know if you spot anything unusual out there. As Pete rides away, Emma returns to the kitchen but not to her preserves. Instead, she moves to the heavy oak cabinet in the corner, the one James never questions because she's told him it holds her mother's fine china. Behind the dusty plates lies a false back panel, and behind that, her emergency cache, ammunition, a spare gun belt, and most importantly, information. She pulls out a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with carefully coded notes about criminal gangs operating in the territory. Her fingers trace down the entries until she finds what she's looking for: the Carson gang's typical patterns. Bank robberies were usually just the first step, a way to draw law enforcement away from their real targets. The wealthy ranches left unprotected while pauses chased bank robbers. A noise from the yard snaps her to attention. Emma quickly returns everything to its hiding place and moves to the window. 2 more ranch hands are riding in, talking intently with Pete. Their body language sets off warning bells in her mind. Too tense, too deliberate. They keep glancing toward the main house when they think no one's watching. The pieces start falling into place. The unfamiliar tracks near the north pasture, the nervous cattle, the perfectly timed bank robbery in town. The Carson gang's reputation for violence comes from their thoroughness. They always have men on the inside, turning trusted employees against their employers. Emma's hand strays to the locket at her throat, the one that doesn't hold a photo but a carefully folded paper containing the names and descriptions of every known member of the Carson gang. She'd compiled the list herself, back when she was tracking them through Colorado. She'd nearly caught them then before love and the promise of a different life led her to Cedar Ridge. Now, watching the men in the yard, she realizes her 2 lives are about to collide. The peaceful existence she's built here, the happiness she's found with James. It's all at risk. But as she stands in her kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of her domestic life, Emma feels a familiar calm settling over her. The kind of calm that used to come before a gunfight, when everything else falls away except the clarity of what needs to be done. The tension builds as midday approaches, the sun beating down mercilessly on the ranch. Emma maintains her routine, but her movements become more purposeful, each task chosen to position her where she can observe the increasingly suspicious activity around the property. Through the kitchen window, she watches as more ranch hands gather near the bunkhouse, their hushed conversations and furtive glances telling her all she needs to know. She counts 6 men who shouldn't be there, faces she doesn't recognize mixed in with the regular hands. They're trying to blend in, wearing the dust and dirt of honest work, but their posture gives them away. These are men who've spent more time with guns than cattle. Emma recognizes the way they carry themselves, the constant awareness of their weapons, the predatory grace that no amount of play acting can disguise. The sound of approaching hooves draws her attention. James rides in from the south pasture, and Emma's heart tightens at the sight of him. He's so trusting, so fundamentally decent. He'd never suspect his own men of betrayal. She watches as Pete and 2 others intercept him, gesturing animatedly about some supposed problem with the herd that needs his immediate attention. They're isolating him, Emma murmurs to herself, recognition flooding through her. It's a tactic she's seen before: separate the ranch owner from the main house, leave the family vulnerable. Her fingers curl around the handle of her rolling pin, muscle memory making her grip it like the weapon it could become if necessary. Moving to the front porch under the pretense of sweeping, Emma catalogs everything within reach that could be used defensively. The heavy oak rocking chair, the stack of kindling by the door, even her broom. In her hands, anything could become a weapon. But those are last resorts. What she really needs is in the trunk upstairs, hidden beneath years of careful deception. A wagon appears on the horizon, approaching from the direction of Cedar Ridge. Even at this distance, Emma can tell it's moving too fast for a regular supply run. Her suspicions are confirmed when she spots armed men riding alongside it, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. The Carson gang isn't known for subtlety. They prefer overwhelming force, striking hard and fast before anyone can mount an effective defense. Inside the house, Emma moves quickly but deliberately. No rushing, nothing to draw attention. She takes the stairs to the 2nd floor, each step carefully placed to avoid the squeaky board she's intentionally never fixed. In her bedroom, she retrieves her guns from their hiding place, the familiar weight of the Colts bringing back a flood of memories. The sound of men's voices drifts up from below. More strangers entering the house through the back door, their boots heavy on her clean floors. They're not even trying to be quiet anymore, confident in their control of the situation. Emma smiles grimly as she checks her ammunition. Overconfidence has always been the downfall of men like these. She hears them moving through the rooms downstairs, rough voices calling out as they search for her. "Mrs. Thorne?" one calls, false concern in his voice. "Your husband sent us to check on you. Are you here?" Emma doesn't respond. She's already moving to the window that overlooks the rear of the house, her skirts gathered up to allow freedom of movement. Years of practice let her navigate the steep roof without a sound. From this vantage point, she can see James being led toward the barn, surrounded by men she now knows are part of the Carson gang. Her mind races through possibilities. The gang's reputation suggests they won't hesitate to use violence, especially against witnesses. They'll want to secure both her and James before the main force arrives, keeping them as hostages while they empty the ranch's strongbox and drive off the cattle. It's a well-planned operation, or it would be if they were dealing with an ordinary rancher's wife. The wagon is closer now, raising a cloud of dust as it thunders toward the ranch. Emma counts at least 8 riders accompanying it, all heavily armed. Combined with the men already on the property and the traders among the ranch hands, she's facing odds that would give most lawmen pause. But Emma Thorne wasn't just any lawman in her previous life. She watches as the remaining loyal ranch hands are rounded up, forced to their knees near the corral. The betrayal is complete. Nearly half the crew must have been bought off or replaced over the past few months. A patient infiltration leading to this moment. She recognizes the tactic because she's used it herself, back when she was working to bring down the Shaw gang in Wyoming. Below her, the search of the house continues. She can hear them growing frustrated, their movements becoming more aggressive as they find room after room empty. Soon they'll think to check the roof, but by then, it won't matter. Emma runs her fingers over the familiar engravings on her Colts. Not decorative scrollwork like most would assume, but a coded message containing the names of every outlaw she's brought to justice. The wagon reaches the main gate, and Emma's practiced eye identifies the man riding point. Marcus Carson himself, the gang's notorious leader. She'd come close to capturing him 2 years ago in Colorado, close enough to put a bullet in his shoulder before he escaped. From the way he favors his left side as he dismounts, that wound still troubles him. Time seems to slow as Emma watches Carson stride toward the barn where James is being held. She knows what comes next. She's seen it play out before. They'll use James to force her cooperation, never suspecting that in doing so, they'll trigger something far more dangerous than simple compliance. The sound of heavy boots on wooden floorboards echoes through the house as the gang continues their search. Emma moves silently across the roof, years of stealth training guiding her movements as she positions herself for what's to come. From her elevated position, she watches Marcus Carson approach the barn, his confident stride betraying no sign of concern. "Bring them both out," Carson's voice booms across the yard. "Let's show Mr. and Mrs. Thorne some proper hospitality." His words draw cruel laughter from his men, but Emma notices the underlying tension in their postures. These aren't just common thieves. They're killers, men who've left a trail of burning ranches and grieving families across 3 territories. James is forced out of the barn, 2 men gripping his arms. Emma's heart clenches at the sight of blood on his temple. He must have resisted when he finally realized what was happening. Still, his head is held high, showing the same quiet dignity that first drew her to him. He scans the area, obviously searching for her, worry etched deep in his features. "Where's your wife, Thorne?" Carson demands, moving to stand before James. "My boys can't seem to find her in the house." His hand rests casually on his gun belt, but Emma recognizes the stance of a man ready to draw at a moment's notice. "Leave her out of this," James replies, his voice steady despite his situation. "Whatever you want, deal with me." The words make Emma's chest tighten with pride and fear. Even now, he's trying to protect her, not knowing she's never needed protection. Carson laughs, the sound echoing across the yard. "Noble of you, but that's not how this works. You see, we've got ourselves a routine. Families tend to be more cooperative when they're together. He turns to his men. Keep searching. She can't have gone far. Emma watches as more men join the search, spreading out across the property. They check the outbuildings, the root cellar, even the chicken coop. Their movements are professional, methodical. This isn't their first raid, but it will be their last. The sun beats down mercilessly as Carson begins to lose patience. He stalks closer to James, gun drawn now. Last chance, Thorne. Call out to your wife. Tell her to show herself, or things are going to get very unpleasant. James lifts his chin defiantly. Go to hell. The crack of Carson's pistol striking James's face echoes across the yard. Emma's fingers tighten on her Colts, but she forces herself to remain still. Not yet. The timing has to be perfect. Mrs. Thorne, Carson shouts, his voice carrying across the property. I know you can hear me. Your husband's being very brave, but I'm starting to lose my patience. Show yourself now, and maybe he keeps all his fingers. Emma sees the moment everything changes. One of the searchers, younger than the rest, spots her on the roof. His eyes widen, mouth opening to shout a warning. But Emma is already moving. The first shot takes him in the shoulder before he can make a sound. The report of her Colt thundering across the yard. Everything erupts into chaos. The gang members dive for cover, their heads swiveling wildly as they try to locate the shooter. Emma's second shot catches another man in the leg as he runs for the wagon, sending him sprawling in the dust. Up there! On the roof! Someone shouts, but Emma is already rolling to a new position, the skills of countless gunfights flowing through her like water. 2 more shots, 2 more men down, not killed but effectively removed from the fight. Carson's voice cuts through the confusion. It's just one shooter. Spread out and flank the house. But there's something in his tone that catches Emma's attention. Recognition, perhaps even fear. Few people have ever seen her work up close and live to tell about it. The gang tries to organize, but Emma's precise shots keep them pinned down. Each time someone makes a move, a bullet kicks up dust at their feet or grazes an arm or leg. She's not trying to kill, not yet. These shots are a message, a demonstration of what she's capable of. Wait! Carson calls out suddenly, his voice different now. Those shots. That accuracy. He steps into the open, eyes scanning the roofline. It can't be. They said you retired, said you hung up your guns and disappeared. Emma rises to her full height, both Colts gleaming in the sunlight. Hello, Marcus? That shoulder still giving you trouble? Her voice carries clearly across the yard, causing several of the gang members to freeze in recognition. Shadow. Carson breathes, the name carrying a weight that makes his men shift uneasily. The Shadow of St. Louis. All this time, you've been hiding as a rancher's wife? James stares up at her, confusion and disbelief warring on his face. The woman he knows as his gentle, loving wife stands transformed, her stance that of a seasoned gunfighter, her aim unwavering as she keeps the entire gang at bay. Not hiding, Marcus, Emma replies calmly. Just living. Until you and your boys had to come along and spoil it all. She shifts slightly, allowing everyone in the yard to see her clearly. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell your men to drop their weapons. Then we're going to have a long talk about all the raids you've been pulling across the territory. The tension in the yard pulls tight, as a bowstring as everyone waits to see what Carson will do. The notorious gang leader looks up at the woman who was once the most feared lawman in the West, his hand hovering near his gun, calculating his odds. Carson's face twists into a snarl as he processes the situation, his hand still hovering over his gun. You may have been something once, Shadow, but you're outnumbered 15-1. Even you can't take all of us. Emma's laugh carries across the yard, cold and confident. Your memory's failing you, Marcus. Remember Dodge City? The odds were worse there and you still lost half your original gang. Her eyes scan the men below, marking each position. Besides, your count's off. It's 11-1 now. 4 of your boys are already bleeding in the dirt. The remaining gang members exchange uneasy glances. They've all heard the stories of Shadow, the mysterious lawman who could shoot the flame off a candle at 50 paces. The revelation that this legendary figure is not only a woman, but has been living among them as a simple rancher's wife seems to have shaken their confidence. "She's just one woman," Carson shouts, trying to rally his men. "Are you really going to let her intimidate you?" But the tremor in his voice betrays his own uncertainty. Emma's gaze shifts to James, who stands watching her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Their eyes meet, and in that moment, she sees not rejection or fear, but a dawning understanding. All those times she'd sensed trouble before it happened, the way she always seemed to know when riders were approaching the ranch. Her past explains everything. "Last chance, Marcus," Emma calls out, her voice carrying the weight of authority she'd worn like a badge in her previous life. "Surrender now, and maybe you'll face a judge instead of an undertaker." Carson's response is sudden and violent. He grabs James, pressing a gun to his head. "Drop the guns, Shadow, or your husband dies right here." The yard goes silent, every man holding his breath. But instead of fear, they see something terrifying spread across Emma's face, a smile cold and deadly as a winter storm. "Bad move, Marcus." Her words are soft, but carry clearly in the tense silence. "You just made this personal." What happens next seems impossible to those watching. Emma launches herself from the roof, both Colts blazing. Her first shot strikes Carson's gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away before he can tighten his finger on the trigger. She hits the ground, rolling, coming up firing. 2 more gang members fall, clutching wounded arms and legs. Carson stumbles back, cradling his bleeding hand, while his men scatter in panic. They've faced posses and rival gangs before, but nothing like this. Emma moves like smoke through their ranks, each shot finding its mark with surgical precision. She's not killing, she's disabling, methodically removing each threat. "She's not human," one of the gang members cries out, dropping his gun and raising his hands. Others follow suit, their nerve breaking in the face of such deadly efficiency. James, released in the chaos, stares at his wife in amazement. The woman he thought he knew moves through the gunfight like a dancer, every motion fluid and purposeful. She's beautiful and terrifying, and suddenly he understands why she sometimes wakes in the night, alert and watchful. Carson makes a desperate break for his horse, but Emma's bullet kicks up dirt right in front of him. "Don't make me aim 2 inches higher, Marcus," she warns. "My trigger finger's getting mighty itchy." He freezes, then slowly turns to face her. The feared gang leader looks small now, his bravado stripped away. "How?" he demands. "How did you hide this? How did none of us see it?" Emma keeps her Colts trained on him as she approaches. "Because you see what you expect to see, Marcus. A rancher's wife, good with a cooking pot and a garden hoe. That's all you thought I was. Your kind never looks deeper, never considers that a woman might be more than your narrow minds can imagine." The sound of approaching horses draws everyone's attention. Sheriff Miller appears with his posse, drawn by the gunfire. They rein up short at the sight before them, nearly a dozen notorious outlaws either wounded or surrendering, with Emma Thorne standing calmly in the middle of it all, guns still smoking. "Mrs. Thorne?" the sheriff asks incredulously. "What in God's name?" "Sheriff," Emma nods politely, as though she's greeting him over tea rather than standing in the aftermath of a gunfight. "I believe I've saved you some trouble. The Carson gang won't be raiding any more ranches." The posse members stare in disbelief as Emma efficiently directs them to secure the prisoners. Her commands are precise and professional, betraying years of law enforcement experience. Some of the older deputies start whispering among themselves as realization dawns. Shadow? The Shadow of St. Louis? Can't be. That was a man. They never did catch who it really was. The evening sun casts long shadows across the ranch yard as the sheriff's posse begins rounding up the surviving members of the Carson gang. Emma stands watching, her Colts now holstered but still within easy reach. The familiar weight of the guns against her hips feels like greeting an old friend, one she's never quite forgotten, despite her years of peaceful ranching life. James approaches her slowly, his eyes taking in the transformed woman before him. The wife he thought he knew completely stands differently now, her posture that of a seasoned gunfighter rather than a rancher's spouse. He stops a few feet away, running a hand through his hair as he searches for words. All this time, he finally manages, his voice rough with emotion. All these years, and I never knew. The woman I married, was she even real? Emma's heart clenches at the pain in his voice. This was exactly what she'd feared, why she'd kept her past hidden for so long. Everything between us was real, James, she says softly. Every moment, every feeling. I just couldn't tell you everything about who I was before. The shadow of St. Louis, he says, testing the words. I remember hearing stories, years ago. They said you could shoot a playing card in half at 30 paces, that you brought down the Shaw gang single-handed, that you... His voice trails off as memories surface. They never said you were a woman. Emma's lips curve in a slight smile. That was rather the point. People see what they expect to see. A mysterious lawman, a legend who appears from nowhere and disappears just as quickly. No one ever thought to look for a woman. Sheriff Miller approaches, his expression a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Ma'am, he says, touching his hat brim. I've got to say, when I rode up here, this was about the last thing I expected to find. We've been chasing the Carson gang for months, and here you take them down while barely mussing your apron. Old habits die hard, Sheriff, Emma replies, her voice carrying a hint of her former authority. Though I'd appreciate it if we could keep my former identity between us. I've grown rather fond of my quiet life here. The sheriff nods slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. Though I expect the territory governor might want to thank you personally once he hears about this. The Carson gangs had a price on their heads for quite some time. Emma shakes her head. The reward money should go to the victims of their raids. I've got everything I need right here. She glances at James as she says this, hoping he understands. The captured gang members are being loaded into wagons, their wounds treated and their hands bound. Marcus Carson sits sullenly among them, his injured hand bandaged, his face a mask of impotent rage. He glares at Emma as she approaches the wagon. You could have killed us all, he says, more statement than question. Why didn't you? Emma studies him for a moment, seeing not the fearsome outlaw, but a man whose choices have led him down a dark path. Because I'm not that person anymore, Marcus. I didn't want to kill anyone today. Just stop you from hurting more innocent people. She turns away from the wagon, but Carson's voice stops her. They'll never look at you the same way again, you know. Once they know what you really are, you'll never be just the rancher's wife anymore. Emma doesn't turn back, but her voice carries clearly. I was never just the rancher's wife, Marcus. That's what you and your kind never understood. Women aren't just one thing. We contain multitudes. The ranch hands who remained loyal during the fight approach her cautiously, their attitudes a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Pete, who'd worked the ranch for 3 years, can barely meet her eyes. Mrs. Thorne, he stammers, we had no idea. I mean, all those times you helped us with the cattle, taught us about tracking. I meant every lesson, Pete, Emma assures him. Everything I taught you about reading signs and tracking cattle. It's all useful knowledge no matter where it came from. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The posse prepares to leave with their prisoners, the wagon wheels creaking as they begin their journey back to town. Emma stands on her porch, watching them go, feeling the weight of years of secrecy finally lifting from her shoulders. James comes to stand beside her, close but not touching. The distance between them feels both vast and insignificant. What happens now? He asks quietly. Emma turns to face him, letting him see everything in her eyes. The skill and strength that made her a legend, but also the love and dedication that made her his wife. That depends on you, she says softly. I'm still the woman you married, James. I still love you, still want this life we've built together. I just yet have a few more skills than you knew about. As twilight settles over the ranch, Emma and James sit on their porch, the distance between them filled with unspoken words. The yard still shows signs of the earlier conflict, scuffed earth, scattered bullets, and dark stains where injured men bled into Montana soil. The ranch hands have retreated to the bunkhouse, giving their employers privacy to grapple with the day's revelations. I think I always knew there was something special about you, James finally says, breaking the long silence. His voice is thoughtful as he stares out at the darkening landscape. The way you could sense trouble coming, how you always seemed to know when riders were approaching even before the dogs started barking. Little things that never quite added up. Emma's hands rest in her lap, no longer hiding their strength and capability. I wanted to tell you so many times, she admits. Every time you marveled at how I could shoot so straight when teaching the hands to hunt rabbits. Every time I woke up in the night and you asked what was wrong. Why didn't you? There's no accusation in his voice, just genuine curiosity. Emma takes a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. At first, it was habit. I'd spent so long keeping my identity secret that it became second nature. Then, as I fell in love with you, with this life, I was afraid. Afraid you'd look at me differently. Afraid you'd see the blood on my hands instead of the woman who loves tending her garden and baking pies. James turns to study her face in the fading light. How many? He asks quietly. How many men have you killed? 12, she answers without hesitation. Only when I had no choice. Only those who gave me no other option. I've wounded many more, brought hundreds to justice, but killing. That was always the last resort. He nods slowly, processing this information. And today? You could have killed them all, couldn't you? Yes. Emma's voice is soft but certain. From the moment they entered our property, I had clear shots on every one of them. But I'm not that person anymore. Or rather, I've learned there are better ways. Sometimes mercy is more powerful than violence. A coyote calls in the distance, and the familiar sound of night birds fills the air. The ranch is settling into its normal rhythms despite the extraordinary events of the day. James reaches over and takes Emma's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Tell me about your life before, he says. Tell me how a woman became the most feared lawman in the territories. Emma squeezes his hand gently, grateful for this opening. I was born Catherine Mills in St. Louis. My father was a sheriff, my mother a school teacher. They raised me to believe that justice and education were the highest callings. As she speaks, the story flows out of her. Years of training in secret, learning to shoot from her father, studying strategy and tactics from books her mother brought home. She tells him about her first disguise as a young man, tracking down the murderers who killed her father. How that act of justice led to another and another, until she became something more than just a vengeful daughter. She became a symbol, a shadow that brought hope to the innocent and fear to the guilty. The name Shadow wasn't my choice, she explains, a hint of amusement in her voice. Some newspaper man in Denver came up with it after I brought in the Hawkins gang. Said I appeared out of nowhere like a shadow and vanished just as quick. The name stuck, and I learned to use it. James listens intently, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. And then you came here, he prompts when she falls silent. Then I came here, she agrees. I'd been tracking the Shaw gang for months. The trail led me to Cedar Ridge, and I saw this beautiful valley, saw you working with your cattle. Something about the peace here, the honest work. It called to me in a way nothing ever had before. She turns to face him fully now, her eyes bright in the gathering darkness. When you asked me to marry you, I had a choice to make. I could keep being the shadow, living a life of violence and justice, always moving, always alone. Or I could try something different, something real. And now? James asks. Now that everyone knows who you were? Emma shakes her head. Who I am, she corrects gently. Being your wife, running this ranch with you, that's not a disguise or a role I'm playing. It's who I've become, who I choose to be. The skills and strength I had as the shadow are still part of me, but they serve a different purpose now. They protect our home, our life together. The first stars are appearing in the darkening sky as James processes this. Finally, he turns to her with a slight smile. Well, I reckon having a legendary gunfighter for a wife might come in handy. Cattle rustlers will think twice about hitting the Thorne ranch now. His attempt at humor breaks the remaining tension, and Emma laughs softly. I imagine they will, she agrees. Though I hope word of today's events doesn't spread too far. I've grown rather fond of being known for my apple pies rather than my shooting. Dawn breaks over the Thorne ranch, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. Emma stands at the kitchen window watching the sun rise over the same view she's seen every morning for the past 5 years. But today, everything feels different. The events of yesterday have changed things in ways she's still trying to understand. The ranch hands are already stirring, moving cautiously around the yard as they begin their morning chores. She notices how they glance frequently at the house, their movements more deliberate than usual. Word has spread quickly. The quiet, kind-hearted Mrs. Thorne is actually the legendary Shadow of St. Louis. She can see them struggling to reconcile these two very different images of her. James comes up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leans back into his embrace, grateful that at least this hasn't changed. They spent most of the night talking, him asking questions about her past, her sharing stories she'd kept buried for years. It feels strange, like removing a mask she's worn for so long it had become a second skin. The men are nervous, she observes, watching Pete fumble with a saddle he's handled expertly hundreds of times before. Can you blame them? James asks, his voice warm with amusement. Yesterday they thought you were just good at spotting approaching riders. Today they know you could outshoot every man on this ranch blindfolded. Emma turns in his arms, studying his face. Does it bother you, knowing that your wife is what I am? James considers this for a moment. It's going to take some getting used to, he admits. But you're still you. Still the woman who nurses sick calves and makes the best apple pie in the territory. You're just more than I knew. He pauses, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Though I do have one complaint. Oh? Emma raises an eyebrow. All those times I tried to teach you how to shoot, acting like you barely knew which end of the gun was which. You were just humoring me, weren't you? Emma's laughter fills the kitchen, bright and genuine. I didn't want to hurt your pride. You were so earnest about it, wanting to make sure I could protect myself if needed. Their moment of levity is interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Emma tenses instinctively, her hand moving toward the gun belt she's now keeping within reach. But it's only Sheriff Miller riding up with 2 deputies, their postures relaxed. Emma meets them on the porch, James at her side. The sheriff tips his hat to them both. Mrs. Thorne, he greets her, then adds with a slight smile, or should I say shadow. Emma is fine, Sheriff, she replies firmly. What brings you out so early? Well, ma'am, I've got some news you might be interested in. Carson started talking last night, hoping to make a deal. Seems he's willing to give up information about every raid his gang pulled in the last 2 years, plus the names of all their contacts in different towns. Emma nods, understanding the implications. That'll help a lot of families get justice, maybe even recover some of what was stolen from them. There's more, the sheriff continues. Word of what happened here yesterday is spreading fast. The territorial governor's already sent a telegram. He wants to personally thank the person responsible for bringing down the Carson gang. I'm not interested in recognition, Sheriff, Emma says firmly. I left that life behind for a reason. I understand that, ma'am. But there's something else you should know. 3 more gangs operating in the territory have suddenly decided to move their operations elsewhere. Seems the news that the Shadow is still around, and living as a rancher's wife no less, has made them nervous. Emma processes this information, feeling James's supportive hand on her back. The sheriff clears his throat and continues. The governor also mentioned something about a standing offer. Said if you ever wanted to put that badge back on, there's a place for you in the territorial marshal's office. James tenses slightly beside her, but Emma shakes her head. Please tell the governor I'm flattered, but my life is here now. Though, she pauses, considering her words carefully. If the marshal's office ever needs advice on a particularly difficult case, I might be willing to consult. Unofficially, of course. The sheriff grins. I had a feeling you'd say something like that. Well, I'll leave you folks to your morning, just wanted you to know how things stand. He tips his hat again and turns his horse, the deputies following suit. As they watch the lawmen ride away, James squeezes Emma's shoulder. "You sure about turning down the governor's offer? Being a marshal would be quite a step up from being a rancher's wife." Emma turns to face him, her expression serious. "I meant what I said last night, James. This is my life now, the one I chose." The shadow did important work, but she was always alone, always moving, never allowing herself to get close to anyone. She gestures at the ranch around them. This is real. This is home. The morning sun has fully risen now, illuminating the ranch in golden light. In the distance, cattle graze peacefully, and the sound of the ranch hands at work fills the air. It's a scene of ordinary life, but to Emma, it's more precious than any adventure from her past. Besides, she adds with a smile, someone has to keep an eye on this place. Seems to attract more than its fair share of trouble. In the following weeks, life on the Thorne ranch settles into a new kind of normal. The initial shock of Emma's revelation gradually gives way to acceptance, though subtle changes remain. The ranch hands no longer startle when she appears unexpectedly, but they watch her with a mix of respect and awe. Her morning greetings are met with polite nods and "Mrs. Thorne" instead of the casual familiarity they once shared. Emma finds herself adapting as well, no longer feeling the need to hide her capabilities. When a mountain lion threatens the herd, she rides out with the men, her tracking skills and marksmanship on full display. The younger hands watch in amazement as she reads signs they would have missed, leading them straight to the predator's den. One evening, as she's teaching Pete how to properly clean a rifle, he finally works up the courage to ask the question that's been on everyone's mind. "Mrs. Thorne," he begins hesitantly, "all those times you showed us how to track cattle, you weren't just using ranching skills, were you?" Emma smiles, running an oiled cloth along the rifle barrel. "Tracking is tracking, Pete. Whether you're following stolen cattle or outlaws, the principles are the same. Reading the land, understanding patterns, knowing where your quarry is likely to go, these are universal skills." Word of her true identity spreads through the territory like wildfire, despite her wishes for privacy. Visitors to the ranch become more frequent, old lawmen wanting to pay their respects, journalists seeking interviews, even a few reformed outlaws curious to meet the legend in person. Emma handles them all with quiet grace, firmly but politely declining to discuss her past. James watches all of this with growing understanding. He sees how she manages each situation with the same tactical precision she once applied to manhunts. When an overeager writer from a Chicago newspaper shows up unannounced, Emma ensures he leaves with a story about ranching life and her famous apple pie recipe instead of tales of gunfights and outlaws. "You're still protecting people," he observes one night as they sit on their porch. "Just in a different way now." Emma nods, understanding what he means. The shadow protected people by hunting down those who would harm them. Emma Thorne protects people by keeping the legend where it belongs, in the past. But the past isn't always so easily contained. One afternoon, a young woman arrives at the ranch, her clothes travel-worn, her expression desperate. Her name is Sarah Mitchell, and her husband has been taken by the Reeves gang, outlaws who've been terrorizing settlements in the Northern Territory. "The sheriff says there's nothing he can do," Sarah explains, tears in her eyes. "But I heard stories about you, Mrs. Thorne, about what you did to the Carson gang. Please, I have nowhere else to turn." Emma feels the familiar pull of justice warring with her desire for a peaceful life. She looks at James, seeing in his eyes that he already knows what she'll decide. "I don't wear a badge anymore, Mrs. Mitchell," Emma says gently, "but I might know some people who do. Let me write a few letters, call in some old favors." Over the next few days, Emma works late into the night, writing detailed letters to former colleagues and contacts throughout the territory. She includes everything she knows about the Reeves gang's patterns and likely hideouts, drawing on years of experience tracking similar outlaws. A week later, news arrives that Thomas Mitchell has been rescued, the Reeves gang captured by a joint force of marshals and local lawmen. Sarah returns to thank Emma, but she deflects the gratitude. "The marshals did all the work," she insists. "I just provided some information." After Sarah leaves, James finds Emma in their bedroom, looking at her old gun belt hanging on the wall. "You miss it sometimes, don't you?" he asks softly. Parts of it, she admits. The satisfaction of bringing justice, of helping people who had nowhere else to turn. She turns to face him, her expression softening. But I don't miss the cost. The loneliness, the constant danger, never being able to trust anyone or put down roots. She moves to the window, looking out over their ranch. The cattle grazing in the distance, the hands working in the yard, the garden she's lovingly tended. This life we've built together. It's worth more than any reputation I had as the shadow. James joins her at the window, wrapping an arm around her waist. You know, you don't have to choose between being the shadow and being Emma Thorne. Maybe you can be both, in your own way. Emma considers this, thinking of the letters she wrote to help Sarah Mitchell, the skills she's passing on to the ranch hands, the quiet ways she's still making a difference. Maybe you're right, she says softly. Maybe the shadow doesn't need a gun and a badge to help people. The sun sets over the Montana hills, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Emma leans into her husband's embrace, feeling at peace with both who she was and who she's become. The legend of the shadow will always be part of her, but it's no longer all of her. She's found something more valuable than any reputation. She's found home. Assistant. The final rays of the setting sun paint the Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple as Emma and James sit on their front porch, enjoying a quiet moment together. The autumn air carries a hint of the coming winter, and the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night create a peaceful symphony around them. It's been 6 months since the day the Carson gang learned the hard way about underestimating a rancher's wife. 6 months since Emma's past and present collided in a hail of gunfire. Life has found a new rhythm since then. The ranch continues to thrive, perhaps even more so now that word has spread about who really watches over the Thorne property. Cattle rustlers and outlaws give their land a wide berth, and neighboring ranches have noticed a marked decrease in criminal activity throughout the region. It seems the mere possibility that the shadow of St. Louis might still be watching is enough to keep the peace. As they sit together, Emma notices a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Cedar Ridge. Her hand instinctively moves toward her gun, but there's no tension in her posture. She's learned to trust her instincts, and right now they're telling her this isn't trouble coming. Rider coming, she says softly to James. Just one. Moving steady, not trying to hide their approach. James chuckles, still amazed at how she can read so much from a distant dust cloud. Friend or foe? Neither, I think. Probably another rider or curious traveler. We've had enough of them lately. But as the rider draws closer, Emma's expression changes. She recognizes the way the man sits his horse, the distinctive rhythm of the animal's gait. Standing slowly, she moves to the edge of the porch, her eyes fixed on the approaching figure. What is it? James asks, noting the change in her demeanor. That's Marshal Daniel Cooper, she says quietly. I haven't seen him in 7 years. The marshal rides up to their gate, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. He's older than Emma remembers, his hair more gray than black now, but he still sits his horse with the same quiet authority she remembers from their days working together. He was one of the few who knew her secret back then, one of the even fewer she trusted completely. Evening, Catherine, he calls out, using her old name as he dismounts. Or should I say Emma now? Emma descends the porch steps, James following close behind. Daniel, she greets him warmly. It's been a long time. The marshal's weathered face breaks into a smile as he ties his horse to the hitching post. Too long, though I have to say you've done well for yourself. He looks around the ranch appreciatively before turning to James. Marshal Daniel Cooper, he introduces himself, extending his hand. I used to work with your wife back when she was making life hell for every outlaw west of the Mississippi. James shakes his hand firmly. James Thorne. Emma's told me about you. Said you were one of the few who knew her secret from the beginning. That I was, Daniel confirms. Figured it out during the Whitfield case. Not many men, or women, could have made that shot in the dark. Once I knew, I kept her secret. Figured the territory needed the shadow more than it needed to know who was behind the legend. Emma studies her old friend's face carefully. This isn't just a social call, is it, Daniel? The marshal's expression turned serious. No, it's not. Mind if we talk inside? What I've got to say shouldn't be heard by casual ears. They move into the house, where Emma puts coffee on to boil while James lights the lamps against the gathering darkness. The familiar routine of hospitality gives her time to prepare herself for whatever news Daniel has brought. She knows him well enough to read the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he chooses his words. Once they're settled around the kitchen table, steaming cups of coffee before them, Daniel pulls a worn leather portfolio from his saddlebag. I've been tracking something, he begins, spreading out several wanted posters and hand-drawn maps. Something big. The kind of thing that would have had the shadow chomping at the bit back in the day. Emma leans forward, her eyes scanning the documents with practiced ease. The Thompson Syndicate, she breathes, recognizing the pattern of robberies and raids marked on the maps. I thought they were finished years ago. So did everyone else, Daniel agrees grimly. But they've rebuilt, bigger and smarter than before. They're not just hitting banks and stagecoaches anymore. They're buying up struggling ranches, using them as fronts for their operations, moving stolen goods across territory lines, laundering money through legitimate businesses. James watches his wife's face as she studies the documents, seeing the sharp intelligence that made her such a formidable lawman. What's their endgame? She asks, tracing a line between marked locations on the map. Control, Daniel replies. They're trying to establish a stranglehold on the entire Northern Territory, and they're close to succeeding. Local law enforcement is overwhelmed, and most marshals can't touch them because everything appears legal on the surface. Emma sits back, her coffee forgotten. Why bring this to me, Daniel? I'm retired, remember? Living the quiet life. The marshal's eyes are steady as he meets her gaze. Because you're the only one who ever came close to bringing down the original syndicate. Because you understand how they think, how they operate. And because... He pauses, pulling another document from his portfolio. They're moving into this region next. Emma takes the paper, her face hardening as she reads. It's a deed of sale for the Anderson Ranch, just 3 miles from their property. The new owner's name means nothing to her, but she recognizes the pattern. A struggling ranch sold to a mysterious buyer with deep pockets. They're getting bold, she murmurs, moving this close to Cedar Ridge. They don't know who you are, Daniel points out. To them, this is just another territory ripe for expansion. But if they succeed in establishing a foothold here, the whole region could fall under their control, Emma finishes. She looks at James, seeing the concern in his eyes. This isn't just about law and justice anymore. This is about protecting our home, our neighbors, everything we've built here. James reaches across the table, taking her hand. Whatever you decide, he says quietly. I'm with you. Emma squeezes his hand gratefully before turning back to Daniel. I meant what I said about retiring. I'm not putting on a badge again. I'm not asking you to, Daniel assures her. But we need your help, Catherine. Your knowledge, your experience. Help us understand what we're really dealing with here. Emma is quiet for a long moment, her mind working through the implications. Finally, she looks up with a familiar glint in her eye, the one that made outlaws tremble when they realized the shadow was on their trail. The Thompson Syndicate operates through fear and manipulation, she begins, pulling one of the maps closer. They start by appearing as saviors, buying up struggling properties at fair prices. But then they slowly take control of everything. Water rights, grazing lands, transportation routes. Before people realize what's happening, they're trapped. She stands, moving to retrieve something from a locked drawer, a journal she hasn't opened in years. I spent 2 years tracking their operations, she continues, flipping through the pages, mapping their patterns, identifying their key players. They're not just criminals, they're businessmen, lawyers, even politicians. The original syndicate fell because we managed to expose their legitimate front, but it looks like they've learned from their mistakes. Daniel leans forward eagerly. This is exactly what we need. Will you help us? Not as the shadow, but as yourself. Emma Thorne, rancher's wife who happens to know a thing or two about criminal enterprises. Emma looks around her kitchen, at the copper pots hanging from the ceiling, the fresh bread cooling on the counter, the photographs of her life with James on the walls. This is everything she left her old life to find, everything she's worked to protect. And now that life is being threatened, not by obvious outlaws like the Carson gang, but by something far more insidious. "I'll help," she says finally, "but on my terms. I won't ride out with posies or get into gunfights. My days of direct confrontation are over." "Agreed," Daniel says quickly. "We need your mind more than your gun arm anyway, though I hear that's still as sharp as ever, judging by what happened with the Carson gang." Emma allows herself a small smile. A lady has to keep some skills polished just in case. As the night deepens around them, Emma, James, and Daniel bend over the maps and documents, beginning to piece together the scope of what they're facing. It's different from her days as the Shadow, but in some ways it feels right. She's not returning to her old life, but rather using those skills to protect her new one. Outside, the Montana night wraps around the ranch like a comfortable blanket. The stars shine down on a peaceful scene, a warm kitchen window glowing in the darkness, 3 people gathered around a table, working together to face a coming storm. To anyone passing by, it would appear to be nothing more than a late-night social call. But appearances, as Emma Thorne knows better than anyone, can be deceiving. In that kitchen, plans are being laid, strategies developed, and a new chapter is beginning. The Shadow of St. Louis may have hung up her guns, but Emma Thorne is about to prove that justice wears many faces, and sometimes the quietest ones are the most effective. As the clock strikes midnight, Emma walks Daniel out to his horse. The night air is crisp, carrying the promise of autumn, and the stars seem to shine with unusual brightness. "I'll send word through the usual channels," Daniel says as he mounts up. "Let you know what we find out about the Anderson Ranch sale." Emma nods, her mind already working through possibilities. "Be careful, Daniel. The Thompson Syndicate isn't known for their forgiveness of those who interfere with their plans." The marshal tips his hat, a knowing smile crossing his face. "They never did figure out who really broke up their operation 7 years ago. The Shadow's secret is still safe." As she watches him ride away, James comes to stand beside her. "You know," he says thoughtfully, "when I married you, I thought I was getting a wife. Turns out I got a partner in fighting crime instead." Emma laughs softly, leaning into his embrace. "You got both, James Thorne. You got both." Together, they stand in the darkness, watching until Daniel's figure disappears into the night. The ranch is quiet around them, but Emma's mind is alive with activity. She knows that somewhere out there the Thompson Syndicate is moving their pieces into place, confident in their power and secrecy. They don't know that their greatest enemy is already here, disguised as a simple rancher's wife. They don't know that the legend they fear most has traded her gun belt for an apron, but lost none of her skill or determination. Most importantly, they don't know that Emma Thorne has found something worth fighting for, that's far more precious than any reputation: a home, a life, and a love worth protecting at any cost. The Shadow of St. Louis may be a legend of the past, but Emma Thorne is very much present, and she's about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming. As she and James turn to go back inside, Emma feels a familiar surge of purpose. The game is changing, but this time, she's playing for stakes that matter more than any she's fought for before. The night settles around the Thorne Ranch, peaceful and serene. But beneath that tranquil surface, a new story is beginning, one that will test Emma's resolve, challenge her principles, and prove that sometimes the quietest warriors are the most formidable. The Thompson Syndicate is about to learn what the Carson gang discovered, that underestimating Emma Thorne is the last mistake they'll ever make. As the seasons turn in Montana territory, winter gives way to spring, bringing new challenges and revelations to the Thorne Ranch. A year has passed since Emma's identity as the Shadow was revealed, and life has settled into a different kind of normal. The Thompson Syndicate's presence in the region has grown more obvious to those who know where to look, though they maintain their facade of legitimate business dealings. Emma stands at her kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant colors while fresh bread bakes in the oven. Her morning routine hasn't changed, but her attention is divided between domestic tasks and the steady flow of information that crosses her table. Letters arrive regularly from Marshall Cooper and other contacts throughout the territory, each piece adding to the puzzle she's carefully assembling. The Anderson Ranch, now owned by the syndicate, has undergone significant changes. New buildings have sprung up, supposedly for expanding cattle operations, but Emma knows better. She's watched the patterns of traffic, noted the strangers who come and go at odd hours, recognized faces from her days pursuing the original syndicate. James enters the kitchen, pressing a kiss to her cheek as he pours his morning coffee. Another letter came late last night, he says, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Pete brought it in with the evening mail run. Emma takes the letter, recognizing Daniel's distinctive handwriting. As she reads, her expression grows serious. "They're moving faster than we expected," she says, setting the paper down. 3 more ranches purchased in the last month alone, all along the railway line. They're creating a corridor. "For moving stolen goods?" James asks, having learned much about criminal enterprises over the past year. "Among other things." Emma moves to her desk, pulling out the map she's been annotating. Red marks indicate syndicate-owned properties, while blue lines trace the patterns she's discovered. They're not just moving goods. They're building an empire. Each property serves a specific purpose in their operation. The Anderson place is their local headquarters, but these new acquisitions... She traces a line with her finger. They're creating a network that'll be nearly impossible to disrupt once it's fully established. The sound of approaching horses draws their attention. Through the window, they see 3 riders approaching. Marshall Cooper himself, accompanied by 2 deputies Emma doesn't recognize. Their expressions are grim as they dismount. Emma meets them on the porch, noting the trail dust coating their clothes and the weariness in their postures. "Daniel," she greets him. "You rode through the night." "Had to," he replies grimly. "Got word from up north. The Thompson Syndicate isn't just buying ranches anymore. They're starting to force sales. The Miller place burned down 2 nights ago. Family made it out alive, but barely. Next morning, a businessman showed up offering to buy the property for a fraction of its worth." James's hand tightens on the porch railing. "The Millers are just 10 miles north of us." "Exactly," Daniel says. "They're moving into this area hard and fast. We've got evidence linking them to 3 other accidents in the past month, but nothing that'll stand up in court. They're too careful for that." Emma's mind races, processing this new information. "They're getting bolder," she observes. "More aggressive. That means they're either desperate or confident, and the Thompson Syndicate doesn't do desperate." The group moves inside, where Emma serves coffee while Daniel spreads out new documents on the table. Reports from other marshals, witness statements, property records, all pieces of a larger puzzle. As she studies them, Emma feels old instincts stirring, the tactical mind that made her the Shadow coming fully awake. "Look at this pattern," she says, arranging the property deeds in chronological order. "They're not just buying random ranches. Each purchase is strategic, creating a web of control over water rights, grazing lands, and transportation routes. Once they own enough property, they'll be able to squeeze every independent rancher in the territory." One of the deputies, a young man named Harris, leans forward eagerly. "So we stop them before they get that far, right? Raid their properties, arrest their men?" Emma shakes her head. "It's not that simple. Everything they're doing appears legal on the surface. We need to prove the connection between these legitimate purchases and their criminal activities. More importantly, we need to expose the people really running the operation. The men we see are just pawns. The real power lies with people we've never met." "That's why we need your help, Catherine," Daniel says quietly, using her old name. "You came closer than anyone to exposing their leadership 7 years ago. We need that insight now." Emma is quiet for a moment, studying the maps and documents spread across her kitchen table. Finally, she looks up with a familiar glint in her eye, the one that James has come to recognize as the shadow emerging from behind Emma Thorne's peaceful facade. "When I was tracking them before," she begins, "I discovered something interesting. The syndicate operates like a spider web, with each strand carefully placed and maintained. But every web has weak points, places where a single break can cause the whole structure to collapse. She pulls out her old journal, flipping to pages filled with coded notes. Their strength lies in their apparent legitimacy, but it's also their weakness. They have to maintain that facade, which means keeping certain records, following certain procedures. If we can prove that even one of their legitimate businesses is actually a front for criminal activity, we can unravel the whole operation, Daniel finishes, understanding dawning in his eyes. Exactly. Emma traces a line on the map. And I think I know where to start. The Anderson Ranch isn't just a local headquarters, it's their record-keeping center. Everything that happens in this territory passes through that property at some point. James, who has been listening quietly, speaks up. Getting into the Anderson Ranch won't be easy. They've got men watching it day and night. A small smile plays across Emma's lips. They're watching for threats, marshals, lawmen, anyone who might pose a danger. But they're not watching for a rancher's wife bearing a welcome gift for new neighbors. Understanding dawns on Daniel's face. You're going to walk right in? Why not? Emma's smile grows wider. I'm known for my hospitality, after all. It would seem strange if I didn't pay a social call to welcome the new property owners to our community, and if I happened to be unusually observant during my visit. The deputies exchange glances, clearly impressed by the simplicity of the plan. But Daniel looks concerned. It's risky, Catherine. If they suspect anything. They won't, Emma assures him. The Shadow may be legendary, but Emma Thorne is just a friendly neighbor who makes excellent apple pies. Besides, she adds with a glint of humor, I'll be armed. With what? Harris asks, clearly wondering where she could hide a weapon in a proper lady's dress. Emma pats her basket of sewing supplies. Information, Deputy Harris. The most dangerous weapon of all. Now, she turns back to the maps. Let me show you what we're really looking for. The group spends the next several hours planning, with Emma sharing insights from her years of tracking the syndicate. She explains their coding systems, their methods of hiding information in plain sight, the subtle signs that distinguish legitimate records from criminal enterprises. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, the deputies take their leave, riding out separately to avoid drawing attention. Daniel lingers, watching as Emma begins preparing the promised apple pie. You've built a good life here, he observes, gesturing at the warm kitchen with its copper pots and fresh bread cooling on the counter. I have, Emma agrees, rolling out pie crust with practiced ease. That's why I'm willing to risk it. The Thompson Syndicate threatens everything we've built here, not just our ranch, but our whole community. They need to be stopped. Daniel nods, understanding. Just be careful. The Shadow could disappear if things went wrong, but Emma Thorne has roots here. Don't worry, old friend, she says softly. I learned long ago that sometimes the quietest approach is the most effective. The Syndicate is looking for enemies with badges and guns. They'll never suspect that their downfall will come from a simple apple pie and a woman's sharp eyes. As Daniel rides away, James helps Emma finish preparing the pie. You know, he says thoughtfully, when I married you, I never imagined I'd be helping to bake a pie that's really a cover for gathering intelligence on a criminal empire. Emma laughs, the sound bright in the quiet kitchen. Life is full of surprises, my love. Besides, she adds with a wink, who says we can't fight crime and make excellent pastries at the same time? The pie goes into the oven, its sweet aroma filling the kitchen. As Emma washes the flour from her hands, she reflects on how her life has changed. The Shadow used to work alone, moving like a ghost through the territories. But Emma Thorne has something the Shadow never did. A partner, a home, and a community worth protecting. Tomorrow she'll pay her neighborly visit to the Anderson Ranch, armed with nothing but a pie and her wits. But tonight, she'll enjoy dinner with her husband, watch the sunset from their porch, and thank whatever fate led her to this life. Because sometimes, she's discovered, the most powerful forces for justice aren't the ones that move in shadows, but the ones that hide in plain sight, baking pies and keeping watch over the people and places they love. The Montana night settles around the Thorne Ranch, peaceful and serene. But beneath that tranquil surface, plans are in motion that will shake the Thompson syndicate to its core. They'll never know what hit them, and that's exactly how Emma Thorne intends to keep it. As the night deepens, Emma makes final preparations for tomorrow's visit. She carefully selects her dress, a modest blue calico that marks her as a respectable rancher's wife, and sets out her wide-brimmed bonnet. Every detail must be perfect, must reinforce the image of harmless domesticity she's cultivated over the years. In their bedroom, James watches as she braids her hair for sleep. "You know," he says thoughtfully, "I used to wonder why you always seemed to notice things others missed. The way you could tell when storms were coming before anyone else, how you always knew if strangers were approaching the ranch." Emma meets his eyes in the mirror. "Old habits die hard," she admits. "The skills that kept me alive as the shadow became part of who I am. I just learned to hide them better." "Well," James says with a smile, "I suppose those skills are coming in handy again, though not quite how either of us expected." Emma finishes her braid and turns to face him. "Life has a way of surprising us. When I came to Cedar Ridge, I thought I was leaving everything about the shadow behind. Instead, I've found a way to use those skills to protect something more precious than any reputation: our home, our neighbors, our way of life." She moves to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape of their ranch. Somewhere out there, the Thompson syndicate is moving their pieces into place, confident in their power and secrecy. They don't realize that their greatest threat isn't the marshals they're watching for, but a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a gift for seeing what others miss. "Tomorrow," she says softly, "we begin dismantling their empire, one piece at a time, and they'll never see it coming." James joins her at the window, wrapping his arms around her waist. Together, they stand in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow brings.